Venezuelan lawmaker Jorge Rodriguez was sworn as president of the National Assembly. He's pledging to uphold the country's constitution and laws during an installation session broadcast on state television. Rodriguez has led the National Assembly since 2021, and in his remarks he said a central priority in the coming days would be to use, and I quote, all procedures, all platforms and all spaces to bring back Nicolas Maduro. Rodriguez is the brother of the now interim president, Delcy Rodriguez, also sworn in on Monday, where 283 lawmakers elected last May. Just a small number of them are classed as opposition. Most of the opposition, especially the faction directed by Nobel Prize winner Machado, boycotted the election. Let's stay with the developments in Venezuela and speak now to Professor Oliver Stuenkel, an international relations expert and professor at FGV's School of International Relations in Sao Paulo in Brazil. A very good evening to you, Prof, and thank you so much for your time. Firstly, how are you processing these developments in Venezuela?
Good evening. This is a historic watershed moment for Latin America. The United States has, of course, a long history of interference in Latin American affairs, particularly during the 20th century, when governments, for example, in Chile or Brazil or several Caribbean countries were overthrown indirectly. However, this is far more relevant because it's the first time that the United States is overtly using military force to topple a leader in South America. And South America is somewhat of a different strategic space than the Caribbean or Central America. So this has, of course, sent shockwaves across the region, with many countries wondering what that means for their national security, in particular because US President Trump has suggested that he may consider toppling other leaders, such as Colombia's Gustavo Petro. So this is a unique moment.
And pardon me, Prof, and given those remarks, right, by the US president and what you've just said about the Latin American countries, how unsettled should they be?
Well, the problem is for many Latin American countries that the justification for US military action has shifted over time. So at some point, it was about drugs. A lot of people questioned that because Venezuela is not a key player when it comes to international drug trafficking. The US Justice Department has actually just dropped its previous decision to classify the Cartel de los Soles, which is a broad description of criminal activity in Venezuela, as a formal cartel. At some point, the Trump administration talked about democracy. That's also somewhat questionable because the US, of course, collaborates with many authoritarian regimes around the world, or even in Latin America, where we have an authoritarian trend in El Salvador, for example. That creates a lot of concern because that means that even countries that have democratically elected leaders may be targeted. Now, I think in the security establishment, the debates are about diversification of partnerships, procurement processes, strengthening ties to other countries. But of course, there's a profound asymmetry. And whatever a country like Chile or Colombia does, it will always be exposed and vulnerable to US action.
And one wonders then, in light of all these developments, we've seen statements, we've seen condemnation, and we've seen, even in the UN Security Council, for example, some representatives even taking it into the elections. But one wonders, how should the world be responding to this moment?
I think that around the world, there is a process of adapting to that new reality. The most important element, I think, is to not embrace some of the tendencies that are currently being pursued by the Trump administration, like protectionism, for example. So I think it's important to preserve trade partnerships around the world, to diversify partnerships. So, for example, Brazil has broad trade relationships, not only with the United States, but in fact, China is Brazil's most important trading partner. Mercosur is currently negotiating and is in the final stages of ratifying a historic trade deal with the European Union. I think countries around the world will seek to find ways to boost their domestic defense industries to depend less on the United States. And, you know, I think in many places around the world, there is a perception that globalization continues without the United States, even if the United States imposes tariffs. And that, you know, this is no longer the world of the late 1990s of unipolarity. It's a multipolar world, and there's many options for countries to hedge, to diversify their partnerships, and thus become strategically more autonomous.
And speaking about the world and how it's changing, the role of the UN Security Council is one that has come under scrutiny over time. And we saw that debate as well with some split voices on how this should be addressed and on how they actually are processing what has happened in Venezuela. So, in light of this divided UN Security Council and how it seems to have lost its teeth, as some are suggesting, over time, how then does this all play out?
Well, the UN continues to be a crucial platform where ideas can be expressed and narratives can be promoted, and where it's at times simply important to state the obvious. This has been a violation of international law, of course. Now, this doesn't mean that the UN can stop these kinds of things from occurring. And we're increasingly, I think, moving into a world in which these kinds of violations occur more frequently. It would be a mistake to blame the UN for them, but it's certainly necessary for countries to also think about the fact that the multilateral order is fraying. We're now increasingly living in a world of spheres of influence. So Latin America is clearly regarded as the US backyard. And I think the major challenge for countries, not only in Latin America, but in other parts around the world, including South Africa, is how to adapt to a much less stable, much more unpredictable world without, without ending the commitment to multilateral orders. So I think these things continue to be important, but it's also necessary to recognize the clear limitations and the dangers ahead in international relations.
Prof, appreciate your time. Thank you so much for speaking to us. That's Professor Oliver Stuenkel, an international relations expert and professor at the FGV's School of International Relations in Sao Paulo in Brazil.